Welcome to the program.
Be glad to be with you as always.
Consequences of Capitalism, Manufacturing Discontent and Resistance. This is a new book you've co-authored with Marv Waterstone, your colleague at the University of Arizona in Tucson. The book is based on What is Politics course that you co-taught. Talk about the book and its purpose and why you wrote it.
Well, as you said, the book is basically an expanded record of courses that we've taught. For the past 5 years, taught a course both for students and for community on the general nature of what is politics, domestic, foreign policy, world affairs, a fair amount of history, economics, and so on. The lectures are broken up into a series. We begin with questions about what's the basis on which you come to know and believe something. How does Gramscian hegemonic common sense get imposed? How is consent manufactured, to borrow Lippmann's phrase? What are the mechanisms? Then we move on to particular areas, beginning with the ones of prime importance for survival, militarism and nuclear war, environmental destruction, on to a variety of domestic issues, resistance to them, social movements, what they can achieve, how their efforts are made to control them. We bring in speakers weekly from activist movements of one sort or another, describing what they do, what kind of problems they face, what kinds of opportunities there are. Varies year after year. These lectures are essentially last year, not this year, of course. And as I say, we keep bringing it up to date each year. It's been a very lively experience.
You write in your preface that asking such questions as, will the species survive? Will organized life survive? Those questions cannot be avoided. There is no way to sit on the sidelines.
Like it or not, that's a fact. It's this generation that will decide whether human society continues in any organized form, or whether we reach tipping points that are irreversible and we spin off into total catastrophe. Same question with regard to the growing threat of nuclear weapons. There's just no alternative to deciding right now. By now, there are other problems. This pandemic will somehow be controlled at enormous and needless cost of lives, but there are others coming, and they could be more serious. Unless we take serious steps to prepare for them, both the scientific work, the social background, and so on, then there will be other major issues of species survival. I should stress that it's not just the human species. We are racing forward to destroying other species at an incredible scale, which hasn't been seen for 65 million years. And now it's happening much faster than it did then. That was called the fifth extinction. We're now in the midst of the sixth extinction.
You know, we're talking on the Ides of March. You remember what the soothsayer said in Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar. Well, one of the things that, is so striking and that you bring up in the book is the connection between David Hume, an 18th century Enlightenment philosopher, and Antonio Gramsci, the noted 20th century Marxist scholar. What's that connection that you draw between them?
Well, David Hume, great philosopher, 18th century, wrote an important book on the first principles of government, one of the modern classic texts on what we now call political philosophy or political science. And he opens his study by raising a question. He says he's surprised to see the easiness with which people subordinate themselves to power systems. And he says that's a mystery because the people themselves really have the power. So why do they subject themselves to masters? And he says the answer to this mystery must be consent, that the masters succeed in what we now call manufacturing consent and keep the public in line by their belief that they must subordinate themselves to power systems. And he says this miracle occurs in all societies, no matter how brutal or how free. Now, Hume was writing in the wake of the first democratic revolution, the English Revolution of the 17th century, mid-17th century, which led to what we call the British Constitution, the decision, a very brief constitution, a couple of words basically, says that the king will be subordinate to Parliament. Parliament at that time meant merchants and manufacturers. And David Hume's close friend, Adam Smith, at about the same time that Hume was writing, wrote about the consequences of the revolution in his famous book, Wealth of Nations. He pointed out that the merchants and manufacturers of England, who now had sovereignty, are in fact, in Smith's words, the masters of mankind. And they use their power to control the government and to ensure that their own interests are very well taken care of, no matter how grievous the effect on the people of England, and even worse, those who are subject to what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, referring mainly to the British rule in India. That's Hume and Smith in the mid-18th century. A couple of years later, in fact, the same year that Smith wrote Wealth of Nations, the American Revolution broke out. A couple of years later, the Constitution was formed, very much like during the first democratic uprising. It's presented as a conflict between the king and parliament, and it ended, as I said, with the king being subordinate to parliament, the rising merchant manufacturing class. But that's not the whole story. There was also the general public, which didn't want to be ruled by either king or parliament. They wanted, as they put it, there was a lively pamphlet period, itinerant workers and ministers reaching much of the general public. Their pamphlets and talks called for being ruled by countrymen like ourselves who know the people's wants, not by knights and gentlemen who only want to oppress us. They called for universal health, universal education, many things. They were finally crushed. And Hume and Smith are both writing after the victory of the merchants and manufacturers, not only over the king, but over the general public. This was reenacted a few years later in the American Constitution. American Constitution was the main scholarly work on it by Michael Klarman calls it the framers' coup, the coup by the framers against democracy. The public wanted democracy. The framers, wealthy men, mostly slave owners meeting in Philadelphia, they wanted to prevent the threat of democracy, much like the men of best quality, as they called themselves during the first democratic revolution. In fact, didn't take more than a few years for Madison to realize what Adam Smith had realized before him. 1792, we discussed this. Madison wrote a letter to his friend Jefferson in which he deplored the collapse of the democratic system that he hoped he had established. Not too much democracy, but at least some. What Madison said that by now, 1792, the stock jobbers, in our day, that means the financial institutions, had taken so much power that they are, as he called it, the tools and tyrants of government. And they carry out, they both work for government and they control government. And they work for their own interests, no matter how much they oppress the public. Well, this is the 17th and 18th century. Many of the same problems exist today. The Gramscian version gives an account of the same principles in modern terms, and many of the same issues arise. We talk about the early days, 17th century revolution, the American Revolution, the way things have developed since, and where we stand now with regard to similar problems. So yes, there's a connection.
Talk about the role of intellectuals, and they seem to be in two categories: organic and traditional. The latter sometimes called disparagingly stenographers to power. I think it was Reinhold Niebuhr, the liberal theologian, who coined the phrase responsible intellectuals. Gramsci called them experts in legitimation. And then there's, of course, what Henry Kissinger added to the widening definition.
Well, the term responsible intellectuals, responsible people, comes from the main liberal theorists of modern democracy called progressive theorists. People like Walter Lippmann, Harold Lasswell, one of the founders of modern political science, Reinhold Niebuhr, considered the theologian of the liberal establishment, highly revered. Edward Bernays, one of the founders of the public relations industry, they all wrote texts about how democracy should function. And the idea was similar, actually, the kind of thing that Hume talked about and that Gramsci talks about. They said that what they call the responsible man, which means responsible intellectuals, educated, responsible men, they have to essentially maintain power. They have to be, the general public, they say, is stupid and ignorant, cannot be left to run their own affairs. They're not capable of it. They have to be controlled by what Niebuhr called necessary illusions and emotionally potent oversimplifications so that they keep in their place. They have a place, as Lippmann put it. They are spectators, not participants, but they do have a role. They're supposed to show up every 4 years and push a lever to pick one or another of the responsible men to lead them. And then they are to go back to their own affairs and not bother us. We, the responsible men, are to be free of the roar and trampling of the bewildered herd. We should not, as Laswell put it, be overcome by democratic dogmatisms about people being able to take control, to work for their own interests. They're much too stupid and ignorant for that. We must run it. There's other versions of this during the Kennedy years. You will recall that we were supposed to bow down to the technocratic and policy-oriented elite, the best and the brightest, as Halberstam called them. The technocratic and policy-oriented elite, they would run affairs for us. And then there were bad guys, the value-oriented intellectuals, the people who were concerned with rights and justice and all this kind of nonsense. They were what were called the wild men in the wings by McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, former Harvard dean. This is 1968, when he was castigating the people who not only question our tactics, but even go on to question our motives and plans. Wild men in the wings, we have to get rid of them, like the people who are marching in the streets and the value-oriented intellectuals are stirring them up. This distinction goes all the way back through history. The modern term intellectual in its modern sense was really developed during the Dreyfus years in late 19th century France, when Émile Zola, other writers and intellectuals were criticizing the gross mistreatment of Alfred Dreyfus, his sentencing on fabricated charges, and they were criticizing the army and the state, and they were bitterly condemned by the immortals of the French Academy for daring to, how can these writers and artists and philosophers dare to criticize our great institutions, the state and the army, and to claim that there was a serious miscarriage of justice. They were the wild men in the wings. Actually, Émile Zola had to flee France to escape the attacks. Some were jailed and so on. This is history. If you're a wild man in the wings and you're daring to go beyond obeisance to the powerful, you are likely to suffer in one way or another, depending on the nature of the society. So there's the wild men in the wings, there's the stenographers for power. Actually, Henry Kissinger, who's a master in the art, put it pretty well himself. He said the role of the intellectual, policy intellectual, is to articulate the thinking of those in power. If they don't put it exactly right, we'll articulate it correctly for them. That's the role of the serious intellectual. And that's how you become a respected, responsible intellectual.
Now, a couple of, around the time of the Civil War, there's a very interesting exchange between Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Can you talk about that, how it intersects with what we're talking about, the role of intellectuals?
Between who? I didn't hear.
Talk about Emerson and his encounter with Hawthorne during the Civil War.
The encounter, I didn't get the names.
Emerson and Hawthorne had a kind of encounter during the Civil War relating to the role of intellectuals.
During the Civil War?
Yeah.
Between
Emerson.
Calhoun?
Emerson.
Emerson and
Emerson.
Hawthorne.
Hawthorne.
Emerson and
Hawthorne.
Hawthorne. Ah, yes. That was quite interesting. During the Emerson, when the Civil War broke out, Emerson, who was, of course, the leading philosopher of the time, was very enthusiastic about the war because he thought it would break down social structures and lead to a more free society. Not that he was in favor of the North. He was against all calls for patriotism. He criticized and denounced them, but he did hope that it would undermine repressive social structures. Very soon, he became a great enthusiast for the war. He wrote poems about, famous poems about how Harvard young people were going out to die and do their duty in service to the Union and so on. Most of the Concord intellectuals, the main intellectual center, went along with Emerson. They were strongly in favor of the war. Hawthorne was one of the very few who didn't. He kept mostly pretty quiet, but he did do something quite interesting. He went on a tour through the South in the latter days of the war, when the war was sort of coming to an end. It was clear the Union was going to defeat the South. And he visited Washington. He wrote about Abraham Lincoln, he didn't deify him in the manner that was considered appropriate at the time. He wrote a mildly critical, mildly favorable comment. He went to prison camps where Southern soldiers were being imprisoned. He talked about them, discussed with them. He wrote a major article for the Atlantic Monthly, the main intellectual journal. That's what I'm quoting, I'm paraphrasing. In the article, he said, look, these young men in the Southern prison camps, they're just ordinary people who were called to battle in a cause they thought was just. We have to treat them treat them with dignity as honorable human beings. And in general, he gave a very measured picture of the victory. He wasn't calling for enthusiastic, triumphal acclaim for our magnificent victory and our magnificent leaders. He was very muted, critical, and serious. Well, the Atlantic agreed to publish the article, but if you read it, you can probably find it on the internet. The article is interpolated with editors' comments denouncing him for what he says. He wasn't laudatory enough of Lincoln. He was too favorable to these Southern soldiers in prison camps and so on. It's a very humane, decent article. He was very sharply attacked for it. He actually died shortly after. We don't know what the repercussions were. But the conflict, the distinction between him and Emerson was very sharp. And that's a very standard example of the difference between responsible intellectuals and wild men in the wings.
As you know, Mars is in the news. There's a Perseverance rover on the red planet sending back photos. Are you able to hear me?
Mars.
Just
planet.
a second.
The planet Mars. Ask him to repeat. Ask him to repeat.
Could you repeat? I'm just not hearing well. Could you repeat?
Mars.
I'll repeat. I'll repeat, and I'll speak loudly. Yeah. Mars has been in the news. There's a Perseverance rover on the red planet sending back photos.
Mars, the planet.
Mars?
Mars. M-A-R-S.
The planet?
Yeah.
About the planet?
Yeah, he's saying.
Okay.
And years ago, you talked about a journalist from Mars.
Oh.
You remember the journalist?
Yeah.
Okay, well, how would she cover the pandemic and the introduction of vaccines?
It's a very strange thing that's happening with the introduction of vaccines. In the United States, a substantial number of people are refusing to take it, overwhelmingly Republicans. Many reasons, distrust of government, distrust of science, other objections, but it's not restricted to the United States. So in France, for example, according to the most recent reports, about 40% of people are refusing to take the vaccine. It's a very strange phenomenon. There's overwhelming evidence of the importance of taking the vaccine if we want to get this plague under control. But fear and a dislike of government, science, authority has reached such points that people are taking very dangerous actions to avoid what has to be done. Now you can compare this with other countries. It varies. So happens to be an article in the New York Times this morning on Australia, which got the vaccine very quickly under control, got the disease very quickly under control. Mainly, one reason is they have a highly effective health system which people trust. They trust the health system, which works very well. We have a dysfunctional health system, others do too. Secondly, they just are willing to take collective responsibility for one another. So they accepted harsh lockdowns, which were very successful, and the disease was essentially controlled. The same has happened in New Zealand, same in Taiwan, same in other countries. But there are places, the United States is one, interestingly, France is another, where the discontent and distrust is so high that a great many people are just unwilling to join in the collective effort to control and put down the disease. And there are many lives being lost. There was recently a study in the United States which compared the city of Seattle with the general situation in the United States. Seattle is one place where the virus was pretty much well controlled by the kind of means that were successful in Australia, Taiwan, New Zealand, South Korea, other places. And the estimate was that if that had been applied to the whole United States, it might have saved several 100,000 lives. These are not small things.
That discontent you spoke of took a dramatic turn on January 6th with the assault on the Capitol. What was your understanding of what went on there?
Well, first of all, it was explicitly an attempt at a coup. They were trying to overthrow the elected government. That's a coup. The participants were a mixture. Rather striking, if you looked at the photographs, there were very few young people. That's quite unusual. Political events, demonstrations, and so on are mostly young people. This was not. This was middle-aged and older people. Many of them were, of course, they were all enthusiastic Trump supporters. He was egging them on. They all apparently fervently believed that the election was stolen. Their country is being stolen from them by evil forces. Remember, almost half of Republican voters think that Trump was sent by God to save the country from evildoers, ranging from, Democratic pedophiles and so on, to minorities, to others who are undermining and destroying their traditional Christian form of life. There were elements there from the more violent militias, the Proud Boys and so on. It was a pretty violent affair, came pretty close to serious casualties among Congress and others. There were 5 people killed, could have been much worse. It was a desperate act by people who are desperate. We have to We can't overlook that fact. A large part of the country supports it. In fact, popularity for Trump actually increased after his instigation of the coup attempt. This is a large part of the country. If half of Republicans think that Trump was sent by God to save us from evil forces, the country is facing serious problems. It's kind of interesting to see what happened to the Republican Party after January 6th. The people who basically own the country, Adam Smith's Masters of Mankind, the donor class, fund the party. They've been tolerating Trump. They don't like him. He interferes with their image of soulful, humane people. You can put our trust in us and so on. They don't like his vulgarity, his antics and so on, but they tolerated him because he was lining their pockets. The entire legislative program was designed to pour money into the pockets of the super rich and benefit the corporations, smash labor, eliminate regulations that protect people but interfere with profits. The whole program was that. So as long as he was doing that, they're willing to tolerate him. But January 6th was too much. And almost instantly on January 6th, the major centers of economic power moved very quickly and told Trump straight out, this is enough, get lost. Chamber of Commerce, major business roundtable, major corporate executives uniformly. Well, Trump took the plane off to Mar-a-Lago or wherever he went. Mitch McConnell, most important figure in the Republican Party, he heard the voice of the donors and he began to pretty sharply criticize Trump. And with him, he and other Republican senators began to race to the exits. But they didn't go too far because when they reach the exits, they're facing the raging crowds that Trump had mobilized. So they're stuck, and the Republican Party is stuck. Are they going to listen to the donor class and restore a more genteel version of Trumpism? Or are they going to be swept away by the forces that remain in Trump's pocket? And McConnell and Trump, the two major figures, they are personally at swords points. They can't stand each other, but they have a common interest. The common interest is to ensure that the country is ungovernable, that Biden can't achieve anything. It's not a secret. It's what McConnell announced very clearly and explicitly when Obama was elected. At that point, McConnell didn't have Congress. He said, our task is to ensure that Obama can't succeed in doing anything. So he cut back the stimulus that was needed, in other ways, hampered efforts to govern the country and deal with the country's problems. Every reason to suppose he'll do the same right now. Trump wants the same thing with different goals. The two of them are combined in the effort to ensure that the country is ungovernable, that the population suffers as much as possible, in the expectation it'll be blamed on the Democrats and they can come roaring back in 2002 and 2004. It may work. We saw it in the stimulus bill that was just passed. The Republicans right now are kind of like the old Communist Party. They follow the principle of what the Leninists call democratic centralism. The party has a policy, it's handed down from above. Everyone uniformly must accept it. No deviation tolerable. So even though the Republican senators and congressmen they themselves support many aspects of the stimulus. They know their constituents support it, but they have to vote against it vote against it 100%. That's the situation we are now. Biden is, I must say that what Biden has done so far is a rather pleasant surprise to me. It's better than I would have expected. He's pretty sharply criticized on the left for flaws and omissions in the domestic policy. Foreign policy is a different issue. Some of these criticisms are, my view, are correct, but a little bit unfair. There's only so much you can do when half of the Senate is, no matter what you say, is going to be 100% against it, and when there are Democrats who will go along with them. Puts a limit on what you can achieve, subjective limit.
Would you favor the elimination of the filibuster, which Barack Obama called a relic of Jim Crow?
First of all, I doubt that it can be done. I don't even think you'd get a majority in the Senate for it. But so it's basically a non-issue. Whether it should be done is another question. The filibuster has been used in very destructive ways, but in the past it was also used in ways to bar racist legislation and so on. It's basically not a good idea, but I think when you start, it's not the fundamental issue. The basic issue is why you have a political party why you have two political parties, both of them dependent on the same narrow class of wealth and power, the donor class basically, and one of them so extreme that it simply abandoned parliamentary politics. And it's now fighting desperately to maintain itself as a minority party. A lot of the major struggles underway now really have to do not so much with the stimulus as with legislation that's passed in the House. H.R. 1, the first legislation passed by the Democratic House, is very significant. It basically fortifies voting rights. Now, that's critically important. There's a major Republican assault on voting rights. There are literally hundreds of legislative proposals around the country in states where Republicans control the legislature to try to prevent minorities, poor people from voting at all, so that the Republicans can somehow maintain power, though they are a minority party. They almost always lose elections, but they maintain power through various means. And this is becoming more significant. They are now in a major effort to try to cut down voting rights so that they'll be able to hang on by a thread. The Democrat H.R. 1, the Democrat proposal, calls for strengthening voting rights. Question whether how this battle what the outcome of this battle will be will have a major effect on the future. The Republicans have a kind of structural advantage in elections in that the Democratic voting base is mostly concentrated in cities, which means that a lot of the votes, given our parliamentary system, a lot of the votes are just lost. If you have 80% votes for a candidate in one place, it means 30% of them are essentially lost. The Republican votes are scattered in rural counties, small states which have representation far beyond their population. All of this gives the Republicans, a structural advantage. They can win an election even if they lose the vote by 4 or 5%. And the current efforts they're undertaking are an attempt to try to sharpen and strengthen that, so they'll be able to maintain power even if they have even fewer votes, even if they're more of a minority party, which they're becoming for just demographic reasons. This goes along with the major McConnell project while he's been in power to try to staff the judiciary, with young, far-right lawyers uh, who will be there at every level of the judiciary, Supreme Court down to the bottom. So they'll be in a position to bar any progressive legislation for a generation, no matter what the public may want in the years ahead. These are all struggles going on. They're part of our highly regressive political system, which, even under the best of circumstances, would lead to a constitutional crisis. That's built in. You cannot continue to function as a formally democratic society under the radically anti-democratic provisions of the Constitution. The most extreme case, of course, is the Senate. The Senate, 2 votes per state means Wyoming with 600,000 people gets the same representation as California with 47 million. Affects the Electoral College, affects many other things. So these are deep problems in the whole constitutional system. They can't be fixed by amendment. Smaller states won't allow it. These are problems that we're facing over and above the truly existential problems. We haven't talked about those, but unless we deal with the coming environmental catastrophe, the growing threat of nuclear war, the serious threat of new pandemics, nothing else is going to matter.
Out of the 8 last presidential elections, the Republicans won the popular vote only once. But to go back to January 6th and talk about the potency of the canard that the election was stolen. Go back to post-World War I Germany and the stab in the back theory that the Nazis used so effectively. That is to say, we won the war, but the communists, socialists, and Jews sabotaged us and sold us out.
I don't particularly like the word hypocrisy. People believed it. It wasn't hypocritical. If it was hypocritical, it wouldn't have been a problem. It's because it was not hypocritical that it's a problem. And the same in the present case. The people who say Trump won the election are not being hypocritical. I don't know about Trump. He's off by himself. But his fervid, passionate supporters pretty clearly believe it. They believe the election was stolen. Their country is being stolen from them. Their traditional Christian, white communities are being stolen from them. They have some basis for it. You go through a rural town in the United States, what you see is houses for sale, businesses boarded up, Main Street closed, the bank closed, and maybe there's still a church. The former industries are gone. The young people are leaving. It's not a white Christian community anymore where other people knew their place. Okay, that's real. And it's the basis for the willingness to believe stories like the election was stolen, even though in fact it's the Republicans who are way in the lead in purging votes, preventing voting, making it hard for Afro-Americans to vote and so on. But they do fervently believe it. So I don't think we should call it hypocrisy. It's much more dangerous than that. It's a wild belief based in elements of reality, which is all, and that's the kind of belief that's extremely dangerous, but also offers promise because you can deal with the elements of reality in it and let the beliefs crumble when you get rid of the elements of reality on which it's based. It's true that rural America has been smashed by neoliberal globalization. It's a fact. And that doesn't have to happen. You can overcome those facts, and with it, the belief systems will begin to erode. Not all of them. The ones that are based on white supremacy, on traditional Christian nationalism, and so on, those are deeply embedded. Those are deep cultural problems. We're not going to deal quickly with the fact that, I don't know, maybe half the population, forgot the numbers exactly, but something like that, expect the second coming to be in their lifetimes. You're not going to deal with that by solving the economic problems, but by dealing with things that are within our capacity to deal with, like the collapse of the economic base of rural communities, the destruction of poor farmers, the takeover by agribusiness, all of these things that can be dealt with, and that erodes the foundations of the very dangerous belief systems. There's no other way to proceed, and you just have to hope that that can work.
The climate crisis continues apace. Just a couple of items on that. In early February, melting glaciers in the Himalayas caused floods, dams bursting, death and destruction downstream in the Indian state of Uttarakhand. That's one news item. In late February, a massive iceberg broke off Antarctica's Brunt ice shelf at 490 square miles. At 490 square miles, the iceberg is bigger than New York City, which is 302 square miles. So talk about those issues.
Well, we can describe them. Anybody who reads scientific journals knows that you regularly see discoveries of worse problems ahead, and they are taking place whether we like it or not. They're happening. What we can ask is, can we take measures to mitigate the threats and overcome the problems? And the answer to that is yes, we can. It's too late to stop that iceberg from pulling away, from other bigger ones from going after it. That's caused by the carbon dioxide that's already in the air, in the atmosphere. The number of particles per million in the atmosphere is rising steadily into a real danger zone. And that's going to continue simply because of the damage we've done already. So we should certainly keep an eye on these threats. It's possible that Greenland has already reached a tipping point where it may just move towards a melting stage, raising the sea level and so on. But the question that should be right before our eyes is, what can we do about it? And the answer is a lot. Another book, which Bob Powell and I just came out with a couple of months ago, mostly based on his very detailed work, very excellent work on how on concrete measures for dealing with the climate catastrophe, global Green New Deal, and it's about that. That outlines measures that can be taken effectively to deal with the crisis in a feasible way with his calculations by others. That book has come out. They roughly conclude that about 2 to 3% of gross domestic product would be sufficient to deal with to bring the crisis, to control the crisis and lay the basis for moving on to what could be a much better future. It's not a loss. It's a better world for all of us if we move to less pollution, better jobs, better opportunities, better lifestyle, all possible within a percentage of GDP that is far less than was spent during the Second World War. Now, of course, it's claimed, well, that was a war for survival. This is a much greater war than the Second World War. The United States would have survived if the world had been divided into a German-controlled world and an American-controlled world, as American planners actually anticipated in the early days of the war. It would have been a very ugly world, but it would have survived. If we don't deal with this one, there isn't going to be any survival. Now, this is a much greater war than the Second World War, but with a fraction of the expenditures then, there are ways to deal with it. Now, if you take a look with Trump, if Trump had had another 4 years in office, we might have literally reached tipping points which were irreversible or come very close to them. His major policy programs were destroy the environment as quickly as possible, maximize the use of fossil fuels, eliminate the regulatory apparatus which somewhat controls them, with the goal of increasing short-term profit for sectors of industry, fossil fuels and others. This is the most malicious program in human history. Barely discussed. That's not what Trump is criticized for. But whatever else he did pales into total insignificance as compared with this. Another 4 years of it, we might have been pretty near the finish line. Well, fortunately, we're spared that, though it might come back in 2 or 4 years, remember. The McConnell-Trump program could succeed, in which case we're in a desperate situation. These policies are renewed. You can barely predict the outcome. But now we have time to try to do something about it. Now, I talked before about the split in the Republican Party. There's a split in the Democratic Party as well, an important one. It showed up on climate policy. So in the months leading to the primary and then the elections, I was keeping a pretty close eye on the Democratic Party webpage because, giving a lot of talks and interviews about it, want to see what they're saying. If you looked up Democratic climate policy, what you got for a long time into August was Biden's program. Biden's program is not what it ought to be, but it's better than anything that came before, thanks to the engagement of Sunrise Movement and other activists. It was not a bad program, not enough, but not bad. Late August, it disappeared from the webpage. And what you got instead was how to donate to the Democratic Party. Well, I'm not on the inside and can't be sure what happened, but I think you can make a guess. The Democratic National Committee, the Clintonite neoliberals, the Wall Street donor-oriented sector of the population party, they don't want this. And I think there's going to be a real battle now as to whether Biden's program can not only be preserved, but must be moved forward. And it must be moved forward if we're going to survive this. That's a hope. Same is true on other issues. Take, say, the stimulus. Stimulus has a lot of good things in it, the recent 1.9 billion stimulus. Lots of good things in it, child poverty, raising incomes for the poor, and so on. But they're temporary. If they're not extended, it's not going to matter much. So there's going to be a battle to extend them and to go beyond what they already provide. These are major battles coming now, both within the Republicans apparently are just going to block everything. It looks as though, at least in the short term, there is very little hope of dislodging any of them from the attempt to render the country ungovernable and somehow get back into power, maybe by cutting back voting rights and other measures. That looks like a unstoppable force. But within the Democrats, there's a lot that can be done, and it has to be done. That's a very, we can all remember that when Obama came into office, he was he came in with the enormous assistance of an army of young volunteers who worked very hard to get him into office. As soon as he got into the White House, basically told them to go home. Thank you, goodbye. It's all under control. You're gone. Unfortunately, they went home. That meant that he could betray his promises, which he did. Within 2 years, he'd lost Congress. If you make the same mistake today, that's what's going to happen. Whatever you think about Biden, he's going to be under pressures from the conservative sector of the Democratic Party, the Clintonite neoliberal, Wall Street oriented sector, and they'll beat back progressive programs, which will be bad enough for the country, but on climate, it'll be disastrous.
In this pandemic economic crisis, community efforts, mutual aid become more prominent and essential. Solidarity, food banks and pantries, clothings, co-ops. Talk about mutual aid and co-ops. I know the one in the Basque region of Spain, Mondragon, is often cited as a successful model.
It was a pretty interesting development. It happened spontaneously in many places, and just people getting together in a community to provide help for one another. If there's some elderly person who can't get out, let's bring him food. If there are people if there's not enough water, let's bring water to people. Sometimes it happened in the most remarkable ways. So like one of the most extraordinary examples was in the extremely poor areas in Rio de Janeiro, the favelas, which are miserable areas of horrible shacks piled on top of one another. They're basically run by criminal gangs, drug gangs and others. If the police come in, it's like an invasion. They have to come in armored cars, but what happened, the favelas, people have no water, they don't have any way to distance, they have no health care, but they did get organized, and it was run by the crime gangs. The crime gangs moved in and organized the favelas to try to help people survive these impossible conditions. And it's happened in poor areas all over. This kind of natural commitment to mutual aid, mutual support, and solidarity revealed itself in many ways. Now, there is, even before the pandemic, there was already the beginnings of a development of worker-owned industries, cooperatives, collectives, localism in agriculture, many such efforts to try to deal with the extremely harmful effects of the neoliberal globalization policies, which have had a really shocking effect on the general population almost everywhere. Could talk about that. But there have been attempts to deal with it. So in areas of the Rust Belt in the United States, where bankers in New York and Chicago had decided that the steel industry should be shifted to China, the working people didn't just give up. They started to develop. They tried to buy out the steel industries, but the owners wouldn't agree to it. They wanted more profit, and they don't like the idea of worker-owned industry. It's dangerous. So that was gone, but instead what's happened is a proliferation of worker-owned enterprises serving involved in the growing service economy, hospitals, universities, and others. Garo Perovitz has written a lot about this and has been involved in initiating much of this work. The Next Economy project. All of these things have been going on. There have been moves, I don't know how far they'll go, to by some of the unions, like the steel workers, to enter into arrangements with some of the extremely successful worker-owned conglomerates mainly in Spain, the Basque Country in Spain. Mondragon has been to see if something similar could be developed here. All of those things could be very important, not only in themselves, but in showing the direction in which society must go towards more collective responsibility, more participatory democratic activity, if we hope to emerge from these crises with any kind of a decent society. All of these things are happening. And the mutual support in reaction to the pandemic that you mentioned is an extremely important part of it.
The name of that book with Robert Pollin is Climate Crisis and the Green New Deal. It's published by Verso. The southern border and immigration. Where you're sitting, the border with Mexico is just 60 miles away. Unaccompanied children in the thousands are being detained there. What would be a fair and just immigration policy?
The first immigration policy should be eliminate the conditions from which they are fleeing. These people don't want to be in the United States. They want to be at home. Home is unlivable. They're forced to flee. We have a large share of responsibility for the fact that it's unlivable. During the Reagan, it goes way back, but during the Reagan years, there was a sharp escalation in the US assault against Central America. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed, more hundreds of thousands displaced, torture, destruction. People are still fleeing today from the wreckage that was created by Reagan's wars in Central America. Well, we can deal with that wreckage. It's very easily detectable. You may recall 2 or 3 years ago, the main source of refugees 4 or 5 years ago was from Honduras. Why Honduras? Because there was a military coup in Honduras, which overthrew the mildly reformist Zelaya government, installed a military dictatorship, placed power back into the hands of the super rich oligarchy, turned the country into one of the homicide capitals of the world, repression, violence. People started fleeing. That's where the caravans came from. Could we have stopped it? Not. The problem wasn't the caravans. It was why it was happening. Why it was happening was because, while the whole hemisphere condemned the military coup, Obama and Clinton supported it. They refused to call it a military coup, because if they did, they would have had to stop military aid to the junta. So they said no. And then when a fake election was run under the military regime, it was condemned all over the place. But for Obama and Clinton, it was a positive step towards democracy. So you impose a horror chamber, people flee. So the first step in an immigration policy is eliminate the reasons why people are fleeing. That can't be done in a day, but you can take steps towards it. That's the beginning. The next step is to stop the criminal policy of enlisting Mexico in preventing people from fleeing from Central America to our borders. The only nice thing you can say about it is that Europe is worse. Europe has even a worse, more cruel and more sadistic policy. It tries to stop people fleeing from Africa deep inside Africa, inside Niger and other places, try to stop them from getting to the territory of Europe and Turkey. And needless to say, Europe has a pretty hideous record with regard to Africa and the Middle East. Don't have to review that. So yes, they're even worse, but that doesn't excuse us. We have to put an end to that policy. Next thing to do is to live up to the basic conditions of international law, provide decent conditions for people fleeing and reasonable opportunities for them to appeal for amnesty and admission. All of this can be done. It's not a huge cost. Perfectly. And instead of that, what we have is, as you say, I'm just north of the border and right to the south of us, thousands of people dying in the desert, literally dying in the desert. It's a very forbidding terrain. In the summer, it gets way over 100 degrees, 120 degrees temperature. There's no water. The program since Clinton, incidentally, the policies have been to try to drive people fleeing into the most hostile areas. So block off the areas where there's fairly easy transit. They could be picked up by a humane asylum policy and drive them into the most dangerous areas where they'll wander in the desert, get lost, and die of starvation. Meanwhile, use tactics like flying helicopters over them, Border Patrol helicopters, to scatter people who are in the desert so that if there's a group together, they'll get scattered, get lost, and die. There are relief efforts from Tucson. They're great, wonderful groups here in Tucson. No More Deaths, the main group, which tries to send people into the desert, set up small encampments where they can offer some medical help if people can make it there, can leave bottles of water in the desert for people who are dying of thirst. The Border Patrol breaks into the camps, smashes water bottles, and so on. This has gotten much worse under Trump. That were sort of, before Trump, there was kind of a tacit agreement that they would leave each other alone, but this has gotten much worse. All these horror stories don't have to happen. And so there's the several layers in which policies have to be shaped, all completely feasible.
The murder of George Floyd triggered widespread protests across the US and even around the world, with Black Lives Matter kind of leading the movement. It is said that this is a moment of racial reckoning. Terms like white supremacy, white privilege, and systemic racism have entered the lexicon. Where do you see the racial justice movement going?
Well, the upsurge after the George Floyd murder was pretty impressive. It didn't happen all at once. It's the result of years of organizing, education, activism, which laid a basis so that when this spark came, the kindling could burn. And it was an amazing uprising. Solidarity, black and white together, enormous popular support, had about 2/3 popular support, which is almost unknown for a social movement. Take a look at Martin Luther King, never came close to that, even at the peak of his popularity. A lot of it is maintained. Some was dissipated, partly because of tactical errors, failures of one kind or another, which you should pay attention to. So the slogan, defund the police, became prominent very quickly. It's a sensible idea, and it has a very sensible interpretation. The interpretation given by the Black Lives Matter organizers, by Bernie Sanders, by Ocasio-Cortez and others. The meaning of it was, let's remove the police from activities where they don't belong. The police have no role in things like domestic disputes, overdoses, suicide attempts, things like that all involve community service organizations. They can handle them properly. Leave the police to what you need police workforce. Actually, Ocasio-Cortez was asked once, what do you mean by defund the police? And her answer was, go to a white community, a white suburban community. That's what I mean by defund the police. If a kid is caught breaking a window to steal drugs, you don't send him to jail for 30 years. What you do is find out what his problem is and deal with it. Okay, that's defund the police. But the slogan was hijacked by the right wing, and it became a propaganda story about, look at these crazy lunatics. They want to remove all the police from your community so you'll be subject to terrorists, criminals, rapists, and so on. Well, nobody wants that. It was a big talking point for the right wing and the Trump campaign. There's a lesson. You have to be careful how to back up your programs with meaningful educational, organizational, and activist programs to say, here's what I mean, it's a good idea, it's good for you, you should support it. Don't fall for the propaganda line that's coming. Well, that was a failure. There were other things, but basically it's a major step forward. And I think you can build on it. It's not the only example. The 1619 program, series in the New York Times was another very interesting step forward. Of course, it's being lambasted by professional historians. You got this detail wrong, you forgot to say that, and so on. Doesn't matter. It was a very powerful recognition of what 400 years of vicious treatment has meant for the Afro-American population and what legacy it leaves. That's a real breakthrough. A couple of years before that, nothing like it. Well, all of these are steps forward. And I'm
Couple
afraid,
more questions? Two more questions.
yeah,
Okay. Hashtag Me Too has brought long overdue attention to sexual harassment, discrimination, and violence toward women. I mean, this is a major departure culturally, socially in the United States.
not only in the United States, it's taking place elsewhere. It's long overdue. It's good that it's being recognized. Steps have to be taken to overcome it.
Now, you conclude the chapter in the book Consequences of Capitalism, the chapter on social change, with Karl Marx's Old Mole. Can you talk about that?
Well, Karl Marx had this image of the revolutionary spirit, which is just below the surface. Going back to David Hume, where you began, there is consent, and power is based on consent. But beneath the consent, there's a current of saying, I don't really want this. I don't want to be ruled by a master. And it doesn't take much for that to break through. And when it does, you have the kinds of changes that really make a society, move a society forward. So that old mole is burrowing there. And it can go in many ways. Like, for example, take the whole, it's a very dramatic fact when you look at the history of the labor movement. In the early days of the labor movement, right through the 19th century, early industrial revolution, the main theme of the labor movement was that having a job is a terrible attack on your personal rights and dignity. Having a job is not something you look forward to. It's something you may be forced into, but it's an attack on your dignity as a human being, your rights as a free human being. Having a job means being forced to live under the orders of a master for most of your waking life. Nothing wonderful about that. Well, in fact, skilled workmen back in the late 19th century, and they had a very lively working class press. They expressed their hope that over time, people wouldn't succumb to this attack on their rights and accept as normal the idea that they have to be subject to a master. They hoped if that day comes, they hoped it would be far in the distance. Well, the day has come. People do think having a job is the greatest thing in life. I think Marx's old mole is right beneath the surface there. If there's an opportunity to think about it, to recognize the possibility that you don't have to be subject to a master, you can run your own life, you can run your own enterprises. That keeps coming very close to the surface. The sit-down strikes when I was a child in New York, in the United States during the Depression, they were a step towards saying, we don't need the bosses. We can take this place over and run it ourselves, which is true. Uh, that's when uh, attitudes changed towards and support for the New Deal measures really grew across the population. That's when the Supreme Court stopped blocking all New Deal measures, when sectors of capital recognized, look, we've got to accommodate ourselves to these rising developments, or else we'll be in real trouble. And I think this keeps coming out. The New Economy project that I mentioned is moving in that direction too, saying you can run your own enterprises. It doesn't have to be bankers in New York who decide whether this enterprise moves to China. You can decide. You can decide how you want to run it. You can decide in solidarity with workers in China and Mexico. You have common interests in making life better for all of you. The unions in their names have the word international. The names usually doesn't mean much, but it can mean a lot, can be brought to the surface. And it's quite striking at this moment, we're in a period where internationalism is in the forefront, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with global warming. These are international issues. Has to be done together. Can't do it in one place. Can't stop global warming in the West. Goes on elsewhere, we're all done. Pandemic has no borders. Labor rights have no borders. The repression of labor in China and Mexico harms American workers. We can work together on this. That's the direction things should move.
Have you gotten your shots yet? Did you get your vaccine?
Did I get it?
Yeah.
Got the second one 2 days ago. So I
Oh,
have a
good.
sore arm.
You have a sore arm. And how are you dealing with the isolation there? Isolation, being alone, you and Valeria, the dogs.
For us, it's easy. I mean, for other people, it's really harmful, but for us, it doesn't matter much. We can stay alone.
Take good care of yourself, and thanks a lot.